Well, shucks, thank you so much for being here. So those of you who are unfamiliar with this format, it's meant to be interactive, breaking down the fourth wall and letting people come on in, letting people interact with us in real time rather than we play a whole concert and then maybe you can ask us some questions. So before we open it up to questions, Maestro, do you want to retroactively set up that tune? Tell us what it was. Tell us how people can spend their hard-earned cash money to acquire a copy of a physical product that has it.
Well, you can buy this only lead sheet. This is for $5,000. But it's part of actually a piece that I wrote years ago. That was like I have a 10-piece band, and I had this 10-piece band had been playing a piece by a clarinetist named Bill Smith, and it was a jazz concerto for clarinet. And actually, I was working with Bill on learning it, and I only had enough space for like one thing on the program. It was a 20-minute piece, and Bill was like, "Well, why don't you write your own version?" And so I kind of studied his concerto a lot, did a lot of analysis, and decided to write my own piece that featured the clarinet with a 10-piece ensemble. And so this was the first part of it, of the suite, and I called it The Rising, because at the time I was kind of a low point of life and I wanted something that was kind of uplifting. So, and I was also studying counterpoint and harmony with this teacher who was teaching me how to mess around with harmony. So I actually took a Thelonious Monk song called Off Minor and put it through this harmonic thing and created this song. And so, and it's on the records back there. And then I re-recorded it again when I recorded a few albums with the bassist Steve Swallow and the pianist Art Landy, and they both really liked this song, and so that was a trio version of it. But it's easier with drums to do the 5, but these guys did a great job with it. So.
Thank you. And so, do we have any questions? We usually do. Do we have any questions at this time? Don't be shy. If you have no questions, that's also valid.
Was off minor in 5/4 time?
No, off minor is in 4. I don't think there is any Monk tune. They're all in 4 except for there's one. Ugly Beauty. Yes, Ugly Beauty's in 3, but I can't remember why. There was a reason why I wanted it in 5, and I actually, I think what I did is I had come up with these chord changes that I liked, and then I was trying to find a melody over it. So I did this thing that I'll sometimes do and write like a whole bunch of melodies over the same changes, just kind of write like 20 different melodies over the same chords to come up with something, and then the one I liked best fit in 5. And so that's kind of how I decided. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions at this time? Well, I'm sure there will be more as we go along, but this next one is the one tune we're doing that Mike didn't write. Do you want to describe it, or?
Sure. Well, Steve Swallow, the great bass player, I'm a big fan of the clarinetist Jimmy Giuffre, and I loved the trio of Jimmy Giuffre and Paul Play and Steve Swallow, and then back in 2006 or 7, I got an opportunity to play in this band that Steve Swallow played in.
And for context, just for those who less familiar with Jimmy Giuffre, the band he's talking about dates back to the 60s, so this is not recent history.
Yeah. And they actually put out some recordings in the early 60s that had a lot of more free music, more experimental music that was on Columbia Records, and Columbia actually dropped Jimmy Giuffre after this, and it kind of sent him into he didn't record for 10 years. He was so upset by it, but it's amazing. Those recordings were then put out, like no one heard those recordings until ECM released them in I think the late 80s or early 90s, and there's live recordings of them. So yeah, when I got this chance to play with Steve Swallow, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And so I got to do a 10-day tour with him in Europe and just hang out with him, and he's like the greatest guy ever, and I could ask him all my Jimmy Giuffre questions and just everything he was up for. We spent a lot of late nights like just talking about Jimmy Giuffre. And so then when I got a chance to, I knew that I wanted to record with him, and I'd been playing a lot with this pianist named Art Landy, who Art and Steve Swallow had kind of a jazz rock trio in the late 60s. They both lived in the Bay Area, and so I got them together to play. And when we were playing, I definitely wanted to play some of Steve tunes because he's one of the greatest jazz composers ever. And so we picked this one, which is called Bite Your Grandmother. And do you know why it's called that?
Only because you told me. I had never heard that before.
Yeah, it's supposedly when John Philip Sousa heard jazz, he said it makes the sound of someone wanting to bite your grandmother or something. Not a fan, you know.
So you may judge for yourselves whether that is in fact how this song makes you feel.
Yes.
Don't literally do it if it does make you feel that way.
Depends. It could be a love bite.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I start no-explaining things, do we have any questions? Response to that one? Yes, please.
Just, I'm curious about the two instruments that you were playing. One, obviously the clarinet, and what's the advantage of either and both of them?
Well, I guess I see them as like, they're almost like two different personalities. So, I mean,
for the uninitiated, that is the soprano saxophone in his right hand.
Yeah, this is a saxophone, even though some people think it's like a metal oboe, but to get technical, the main difference between these instruments and what makes the sound is the shape of the bore. So even though this has a little cone at the end, it's cylindrical and it's the same diameter all the way through, whereas this is conical, it's a cone. And so when Adolph Sax, who invented these in like the 1840s, his idea was to make something that could kind of have the subtlety and the softness of this, but that could play loud like brass instruments. And so he kind of meshed the concept together. And so this thing is a lot louder, and also like after going from this is, I can think of this as like driving a Model T, and this is like a Corvette, because the clarinet has open holes, and it's also structured in 12ths, which is like a bigger space. It's like you have the same set of fingerings in the lower register and upper register, but they're in different keys, whereas this thing has the same set of fingerings in both keys. So this is, for me, a lot easier to play than this one. So it's fun, and they're like different. This one can do all these things that this one can't do.
But being a glutton for punishment, you continue to play the one that's less fun.
Yeah, well,
less easy anyway.
Clarinet, there's a lot of names for it. People call it the misery stick, or people say, seriously, they say it was invented by 3 people who never talked to each other.
Go ahead, Noah.
Which did you
start with? I started with alto sax and moved to tenor sax, and I still play my tenor sax. But do you play anything else, or did you start with the clarinet and move to soprano, or what's your instrument like regime that you've gone through to get to these two finalists?
Sure. Well, I think like most people, you start with the alto sax because that's probably of all the saxophones, it's the easiest to maneuver and it's smaller. But actually, I wanted to play tenor sax. The first kind of saxophone I wanted to play was the Hall & Oates 80s song, Man Eater. Really. And I remember, I knew if you look at the video, there's a great video, and the sax player's there in the light, and there's all this smokiness, and it's just, prime 80s saxophone. So that's what I wanted to play, and I remember getting in 5th grade to getting the saxophone, and I was like, it was an alto, and I just knew, like, that's not the one in the video, I don't want to play that. And so I did go home that night and try to play the Man-Eater solo on the alto, but it didn't sound right. And I saw then the music teacher I had at the time, when I walked in, he was playing a tenor sax, and I was like, that's the one I want, but I was too small. And they made me wait until the 7th grade, and finally in 7th grade, I got a tenor sax, and I was very excited because I could then play the Man-Eater solo. And then I played both of them. And then I think I heard a soprano sax. It was like the early days of the Marsalis brothers becoming famous, and especially Branford Marsalis was playing with Sting and played a lot of soprano sax, and so I was like, I want to play that. And so then I got a soprano sax, and then when I was in high school, I was like pretty serious from the time I was 14, like music is the only thing I am good at in school and that I want to do. And so my teacher at the time said, if you want to be a musician, a professional musician, you need to play flute and clarinet. And so I picked those up, and I hated the clarinet because it's just everything that the saxophone wasn't. It was just like really easy to squeak on. It was difficult to play. And I actually, even through graduate school, I couldn't really play the flute and the clarinet that well. And then when I moved to New York City, I was listening to a lot of, in particular, a clarinetist saxophonist named Chris Speed, who was playing a lot of Balkan, Eastern European music on the clarinet. And I was kind of started to get into that. And then it was kind of fun to play because it was different than the saxophone. And then I heard Jimmy Giuffre, and that made me want to play it more. And I started to bring it out to play with people, and they would always be like, oh yeah, bring the clarinet again. And so then that kind of spurred me to want to play it more. But at first it was about 10 to 15 years of practicing the clarinet exclusively, almost to try to get it to where my saxophone playing was. And then I noticed also that when I would play the clarinet, a lot of that stuff would transfer over to the saxophone. So it actually, like issues that I had practicing the saxophone that I couldn't really get to, playing the clarinet helped me. So that's the long story.
When did the bass clarinet enter the regimen?
Bass clarinet, well, once I got to where I could play the clarinet kind of and get around it a little bit, then I started to hear different people like Marty Ehrlich and Don Byron and, of course, Eric Dolphy play the bass clarinet. And I really, really wanted those, but they're really expensive. And so I was waiting and got a good deal on one of those. I had an old one from the 40s that was cool, but it was still always a struggle. So I guess I played that, started in like when did I get that bass clarinet? Maybe 2002, 2003. And but still always had kind of a rough relationship with it because I had this older horn that was kind of wonky and like really difficult. And then just a year ago I got this one, and which it's a brand new bass clarinet, and it's like changed my life. So it's like it plays like a clarinet. But yeah, bass clarinet is great. Or if you like Hitchcock films, like North by Northwest has great bass clarinet lines in it. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
No problem.
Just a quick one. Which of the CDs at A is the grandmother on?
The yellow one, which is called Singular Dream. Yeah, and there's 2 CDs that I did with Art Landy and Steve Swallow, and we did one long recording session, but we actually got recorded almost 3 CDs worth of music. And the first hour we went in and we played completely improvised, which wasn't necessarily my idea, but they were like, we should do this. And if 2 jazz elders who you respect tell you to do something, then you just kind of do it. So they dragged me into it, and I was like, but they're such great improvisers, and so we ended up with a lot of great improvised pieces and then all these compositions, and so I put them in 2 different CDs. So this is on the recurring dream. No. Singular Awakening. They're related titles. One's called Recurring Dream, and then the other one is called Singular Awakening. Yes.
You know, that last song, you obviously familiar with it, but you two guys had more than a passing familiarity with it. So I mean, Henry, your eyes were closed almost the entire time. So this is something you've played before.
I mean, I learned it 3 weeks ago when I found out that Mike was coming up and here and doing this. Some of my students will attest that they were coming to my lessons like, okay, this is where I put my money where my mouth is. This is hard, so I'm not going to go into panic, try not to suck mode, and I'm instead going to systematically figure out fingerings that work for this and play through it really slowly and make sure that I can systematically and incrementally work my way up. And yeah, I mean, I'd heard the tune before, but
I mean, to be doubling on that riff and all the dissonance that's in there, it was just phenomenal.
it was fun. Well, and one thing, well, go ahead, Henry. Henry knew the tune from a long time ago.
Yeah, because it's on a Steve Swallow record from the early 90s, something like that. Yeah. Yeah. So I was familiar. I had never played it before, but the song, it's a new melody written on a song structure that we're all familiar with. But even furthermore, the song structure we're taking a bunch of liberties with. So yeah. So the melody especially is. Then once you get out of the melody, which for these guys is just so dexterous and angular and rhythmically, and for me it's a challenge to kind of accompany, so I have to know it. But then once we get out of that section of the song, we're familiar with the song structure. It's loosely based on, but there's a lot of liberties. So because we know that song structure so well, you can get loose and drift in and out of it. So it actually requires maybe even a little bit of getting away from the printed sheet. So it's.
And to further pull back the curtain, and then I'll get to your question, Sherm, we rehearsed for about 20 minutes earlier today, and part of that was logistics, and part of that was deciding like the things like that melody that needed to be very coordinated, we would work those out. But because Mike is such an inventive improviser, I wanted to make sure we didn't get enmeshed in a certain way of playing these tunes beyond just getting the basic mechanics of them together. So if we played them for longer, there was some danger that we'd become attached to a certain approach that we would then either be regurgitating later or would have to work harder to unembed from.
Yeah, so we rehearsed the launch pads, basically, and then the improvisation parts we didn't.
Which wound up defeating the purpose probably of the whole exercise of composing in the first place, was to just get away from, don't get too enmeshed.
Well, I mean, it's a funny thing about jazz is that there's so, and I mean, the level of improvisational flexibility we afforded ourselves on this tune was maybe more than you would hear in a typical restaurant gig, for example. But I mean, that'd be a pretty hip restaurant, actually. But there's often this interesting, and Mike is such an intricate composer too, this interesting balance of the composed parts of a piece of jazz music or something being interpreted through a jazz lens, where there are important and non-negotiable parts of the song, and then there are things where it's expected that you improvise and take liberties, and it takes a certain leap of faith and communication to find a compatible balance in that regard. So one more question before we play the next one. Sure.
Can you talk about the challenges of playing without a drummer and how each of you independently face those challenges?
Wow. Well, actually, when I'm playing clarinet, playing without a drummer is kind of nice because it's a lot of drummers, actually, depending on the cymbals they use sometimes, but it can be loud and overpower the clarinet. And that's one of the biggest challenges that I've had to kind of learn to play the clarinet in a louder volume. And at first, it used to squeak and squawk a lot more when I would put that much air. But now it's a little bit easier. But I think of course, the rhythmic element, like there's a lot of times, especially when you're coming up learning, that you tend to like rely on the drummer to keep things, and especially horn players, I get accused a lot of just being lazy with the time, meaning and with the form, sometimes we rely too heavily on the rhythm sections, or if you spend too much time playing along with play-along tracks, then you don't develop a strong enough sense of time. And so had enough older musicians who said, don't do that, and practice things to develop your sense of time really well. But it's definitely like, I feel like I have to be really clear with the time, or if I want to do something that's against the time or blur it, I even need to be really clear and deliberate with that. But if I'm not solid with the time, then yeah, it can make these guys feel like, what are we doing? So you have a lot more responsibility maybe without it.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge for me, I don't know, to me is obvious. There's not like a partner in the timekeeping. I mean, I have Noah, and we're all keeping time together.
Though on a tune like that, I'm as likely to be transgressing it as I am to be laying it down.
Yeah, but or like the first tune's in 5, so that's it's a little bit of a hassle without a drummer. And it's odd meter is something that I'm always kind of working on anyway. So, in a soul-bearing moment, I'll admit that's for me. I feel like a hole for me is playing odd meter. So I'm always working on odd meter. So then to come and play in 5 without a drummer, I was like, oh crap, this is a freaking deficit for me. But it's So it's and I'm finding that doing something that's difficult for myself when I have a rhythmic partner is a lot easier than now, like if we were playing that tune in 5 earlier and we had a drummer, I'd probably might have taken different paths or different approaches. But since I'm a little bit the sole keeper, I mean, again, Noah's playing in time and as a rhythm section player with me. But so playing on like the first tune in particular is interesting for me, and challenging.
Well, and the one thing I will add, and you can ask one of my students sitting against that wall about the cosmic groove wavelength sometime afterwards. But in essence, a way that has been really helpful for me to think about it is that timekeeping is usually defined as an externalized thing. Someone is keeping the time, the drummer is keeping the time, but time is. Battery runs out on that clock, a second is still the same value that it was, it's just that device is doing a less accurate job of conveying that. And so, in a sense, with or without a drummer, it's everybody in the band's responsibility to fully, I feel like I know I don't want to overspeak about like dancer terms. We need to embody the time. We need to feel all these layers of not just the tempo, but the groove. Like how does all of this rhythmic information that underpins the tune, how does it feel? And if we're all feeling that in a compatible way, then theoretically we could be having this conversation and the time could be going by and we'd all come back in the same place because there's this strong sense of that undergirding just our consciousness while we're playing it. I can't claim that I'm there every measure of every tune, but that's what I aspire to, is to just, and then the drummer, if a drummer is there, it can make it exciting and interactive and make the groove more explicit, but it's not hopefully then giving me information that I didn't already have internalized regardless of what the instrumentation is. So now would be a great time for you to give a sentimental introduction to this next tune.
The next one is... okay. He faked me out. So, yeah, when I was getting ready to record with Art Landy and Steve Swallow, I wanted to write some new songs, and I don't know how I guess I was thinking about Billy Strayhorn a lot, and Duke, and their sounds and their harmonies and the way the chords moved, and so I wanted to write something that had that vibe, and then also I wanted to write a song for my wife, who's over there. And yeah, she's kind of like I felt like the thing that when everything is not so well or whatever, the thing that you kind of warm yourself up to, and also like I'm being from Maine, like it's always cold up there, and I'm kind of like cold-bodied, and she's Jamaican, so she's a lot warmer. So I felt like felt like even being next to her physically was like a heater. And so I wrote this song and I called it Hearth, because she's the hearth of my life. So, yeah, I know. I come from corny people, so I can. Earnest. And I grew up loving Barry Manilow, who I still do love. So yeah, I can out corny anyone. So yeah. Yes. Yeah. So let's see. Right on it. You got your glasses? I do now. Okay. For this one.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions at this time? Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. This is wonderful. My question for you is, when you're composing, do you compose first and then determine the instrument you'll play it on, or compose for a particular instrument?
Oh, that's a good question. Both. That one was, I was sitting at the piano, and for a long time when I first started composing, I would always sit at the piano, and then this clarinetist that I mentioned earlier, Bill Smith, he lived in Seattle, and I went out and hung out with him first to learn to play his piece, but also I wanted to ask him a lot of composition questions. And he was one of the composers that, along with Dave Brubeck and other composers, that studied with this famous French composer, Darius Milhaud, when Milhaud was teaching at Mills College in the 50s. And so Bill Smith said that Darius Milhaud told him the best way to compose was to go sit under a tree. And I was like, And the reasoning was because a lot of times if you're just linked to one instrument, sometimes that can kind of limit or control what you compose. And especially where I'm not I don't have a lot of piano skills, sometimes what I would write would be limited by what I could do on the piano. So then I would actually just go, and I live across the street from Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and there's actually an area that has these big pillars with busts of Mozart and Beethoven on it. And so I would Jonathan, poor guy. That's my nephew, Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan. There he is. Hi. But I know you gotta go. But so I would go sit under the composers' heads and just write. And I actually did notice that there were a lot of things that would come to my brain that I had never really thought of, and I would usually bring some instrument, there's a thing called a melodica, which is it looks like a little piano that you can blow into. And I could just kind of check the notes, but just conceptually, I came up with a lot of things that I wouldn't have thought of if I was just sitting at the piano. And then I would kind of write out whatever I could, if it was just a sketch or something really precise. And then I would come back and kind of sit at the piano. And then I have written a few things actually on clarinet and saxophone. And I even think it's strange that I play those instruments the most, but I don't really write anything on them. And I don't know why. Maybe it's because I automatically think in them, but to contrast, like right now I'm writing a piece that's a completely different thing. That's a sextet for bassoon, trumpet, accordion, violin, me, and acoustic bass. And so that is a lot of just really imagining what the instruments are going to sound like and kind of writing for that. And I kind of challenge myself to write this piece doing different techniques than I'd used, and try to imagine what it's going to sound like. And then, and also what I noticed was the more I got away from the piano, kind of the inner ear started to kick in. And so I would start to have these things where I would write stuff on the staff, and then I would get back and it would actually sound like what I heard in my head, which was like, wow, it's kind of magical, but it happens. So, long answer. But yeah.
Thank you. Don, did I see your hand up? Yes.
Is Bill Smith the clarinetist that played with Dave Brubeck?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
And one thing that really impresses me and catches my attention is the round, full, and strong tone that you get from the clarinet. And I think I've heard other clarinets that are more piercing in tone. How do you manage that? It's obviously practice, but is there some secret to sauce or what have you?
There kind of is Bill Smith, definitely check out all of his music. He and Brubeck met at Mills College studying with Darius Milhaud, and Bill Smith had been in New York studying at Juilliard and playing on 52nd Street in 1946. And then he said he didn't like the clarinet teacher there, and he really wanted to study composition. And when he heard about Darius Milhaud, he went there. And there's actually a recording called the Dave Brubeck Octet, which is way before the famous quartet. And you should listen to those. It's like they were really interested in using kind of jazz, American popular song chords and melodies, and combining it with kind of classical ideas of composition. And Bill wrote a piece called the Schizophrenic Scherzo that's just really bizarre. I think the clarinet tradition, because it started off as an orchestral instrument, and then especially since Benny Goodman was the most famous, that tended to be the sound, even though he could play really loud, but it wasn't as thick. And then when I heard Jimmy Giuffre, that was the person, like his sound is almost more airy, like a Miles Davis version of the clarinet. And so I was really inspired by that. But when I first started playing clarinet, in particular with drummers in louder situations, I couldn't cut, and I would try to blow louder and louder. And Bill Smith actually used to use a microphone that you could put in. This part of the clarinet is called the barrel, and it's a little thing that you could put inside of it that's like a pickup. And Bill was always telling me, like, you need to get a pickup so you don't have to blow so loud. But I didn't want to carry around a lot of stuff, and so I have a relationship with my first saxophone teacher, whose name is Bill Street, not Bill Smith, but he's 94 years old and still in good shape, and he makes mouthpieces. And so he was always on this like quest to make this. He was like, I'm going to make you this great jazz clarinet mouthpiece. So every time that I would go back home, I would go see him, and he'd have a different mouthpiece. And he was like, try this out. So each time, because he knew the problem was like how to play loud, but if you play loud to a certain point, it can't really cut, it gets thinner. So he kept working with this mouthpiece, and I was like his guinea pig, and I'd come back and be like, nah, this one doesn't work, or send recordings. And so then finally, like this mouthpiece, which I got in January 2020, I remember it came in the mail, and I had a recording session the next day, and I'd never like play a mouthpiece that new on a session, but this thing it kind of did it all. It allowed me to play really loud, and in particular, when you get in the higher register, when you play loud, the clarinet, it's very easy for it to get thin and piercing, which is useful for some parts of music, but I didn't necessarily want to do it. And so this mouthpiece, of which is the only one in the world, it kind of does that. You can blow a lot of air into it, and it doesn't buckle, and then it actually keeps a tight sound together. But that's the thing that all clarinetists, we go through that. If you're playing in a loud jazz setting, or sometimes I even play with rock bands, which that I'll use a microphone, but it's taken a while, like probably 15 years of just back and forth, and a lot of bad experiences where I was playing in a loud situation and trying to blow so hard, and it either, like one thing that people often do is to get louder is you'll use a reed that's more resistant. So when you blow, it can get a lot louder, but then sometimes that causes you to use more pressure with your jaw. And so I got in this thing where I was like, what they call biting too hard and using harder reeds, and I was like, this isn't a good direction, it's not sustainable. So finally this one I've found a balance, but I'd say it's only in the last maybe 5 years that I felt like I've gotten really what I wanted, this type of sound. But yeah, it's taken a while.
Right on. So for this, we've got two more, and this next one, again, since so much of Jazz Up Close is about breaking the proverbial fourth wall, I will reveal that we decided, because Mike, in different ensembles of different sizes, has done really fascinating work with fully improvised pieces where there's some kind of prompt and the band plays with that. So we decided we were going to do one of those, and I decided not to ask him any further questions because, I didn't want to cook the books and contrive something that was supposed to be spontaneous. So I literally, aside from the fact that he's playing the bass clarinet, have no idea what's about to happen. And maybe he's going to give us some instruction. I don't actually know how he works with this stuff. Mike, what are we going to do?
Is that okay? No. I figure we're close to Wesleyan, so you can do some experimental stuff like that. You can't do that in Maine, where I'm from. You get kicked out of the state.
All right. Thank you. So we have one more, but before, and I'll take a couple more questions if there are any, but a couple logistical notes. If you are feeling like your hips are imbalanced due to the weight of the extra cash dollars in your pockets, you have come to the right place, because you can help subsidize this program by unburdening yourself in that way with the punch bowl in the back. Regardless of whether you do so, there's Mike's merch area. I certainly encourage you to check out some of his music and bring it home for yourselves. And if you would like to hear more such things, there's a 3-pronged mailing list back there. If you would like to be on my mailing list, on Mike's mailing list, or on the Resonant Motion mailing list, you can sign up. If you are already on one of them, but not all of them, sign up and check the according box. I'll assume as a default that you'd like to be on all 3 if you do not state otherwise. But I promise I will not sell your email address to anyone who will sell you Canadian prescription meds or... I mean, you don't do that, right, Mike?
I do, yeah.
Okay, so we'll get back to you on that.
Ozempic. Just Ozempic.
So I think that's it on the logistical end. Are there any more questions before we play one more tune? Yes, Steve.
Real quick one. Who do you listen to when you're thinking of composing, regardless of the instrument?
Ooh, it depends. Like the last piece that I was writing, I really wanted to hear different stuff, so I was listening to a lot of kind of 20th century composers like Stockhausen and Xenakis and Ligeti, but probably the music that I listen to as much at home a lot is like Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye and things like that, or Charlie Parker. But yeah, usually if depending on what I'm writing, because I don't really write in necessarily one type of style all the time, so I'll tend to listen to things that might be in that style to try to either get ideas or to use it as something to kind of like push back against, like go against. So, but yeah, mainly things that I haven't, trying to always find things in terms of composing that I haven't heard before to get new ideas.
There's a lot of Paul Horn.
I love Paul Horn. I got to meet him once, which was awesome. But yeah, I love his music a lot.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I love the sound of bass clarinet, always have, and of course I'm a big Eric Dolphy fan. I'm just curious, I mean, Dolphy is seen as one of the real masters of the instrument, but we're a few generations removed from that now, so I'm curious to know if you listen to his music much, or if you've been more, you mentioned Marty Ehrlich, so certainly he's a great clarinetist and bass clarinetist. Do you consider Dolphy to be one of your inspirations, or what?
Yeah, I think, I mean, aside from Dolphy, the only recording that I've heard on kind of bass clarinet in a jazz setting was there's a few tracks of Harry Carney playing. There's one where he plays I Don't Stand a Ghost of a Chance with You as kind of a feature with strings. It's really beautiful.
Harry Carney, who was best known as the baritone saxophonist in the Duke Ellington Orchestra.
Yes. Thank you, jazz professor. But yeah, and I think what Eric Dolphy did, it was so crazy. No one had thought of playing that instrument that way, and he just single-handedly kind of put it on the map. And even I heard this story where like he played a lot with the bass player Charles Mingus, and Mingus didn't actually like it. He didn't want him to play it. And Dolphy brought it anyways and played, which if you know anything about Mingus, he's not a person that you'd want to cross. So Dolphy was kind of a sweet guy. But I think he could do that. But people of today, certainly, like one of the first records that I heard of modern bass clarinet playing was Marty Ehrlich's, this beautiful band called the Darkwoods Ensemble. And Marty actually lives a few blocks from me, and so he's like there's several people that I call my clarinet older brothers who have been really friendly and generous and encouraging to me. And Marty is one of them. And then another clarinetist who lives in San Francisco named Ben Goldberg, who they actually did a record in 1992 where it starts off with two bass clarinets together. That's really awesome. And then of course Don Byron, especially on the Bill Frisell records, him playing it. And I'm trying to think, there's a guy who was here, I don't know, when was Todd Marcus here?
2019, I think.
Yeah. So Todd, the other thing I noticed when I played clarinet versus saxophone is like the saxophone has tended to be like more competitive, and maybe what draws you to the saxophone is like the flashiness or certain personalities, like myself. But then being in New York, it's like there's just so many, and everybody is so good. And playing the clarinet, it was almost like a lot more friendly, and like kind of a kinship. And so, I don't know who else. There's another great guy named Oscar Noriega who lives in New York who plays great bass clarinet. And but yeah, Ben Goldberg, Marty Ehrlich, Oscar, Todd are all some of my favorite bass clarinet players. Michael Moore, who lives in Amsterdam, he's also a favorite.
And I'm going to be counterintuitive, and I'm so sorry, Don, you can come ask questions afterwards, but I told the folks at the library we would be done at 4:30, but because of the closing time, I don't want to push back too far, and I do want us to play this one additional tune, especially because it is an unreleased track from the epic trio session Mike was talking about, so there's not really going to be other opportunities to hear it except for right now. So, as if you didn't feel special enough being here, do you want to, for real?
Oh yeah. Well, when I was getting ready to record with Art and Steve, like if Steve Sarlo's music, and his recently deceased wife Carla Bley, they're two of my favorite composers ever, so definitely listen to their music. But Steve's music, being a bass player, and I know he's always talks about Bach, and he's very inspired by Bach, has a lot of interesting chordal movements and bass movements. So I was kind of writing this song, thinking about him, and then also thinking about like my parents in Maine, and like I feel like James Taylor and the aesthetic of his music sort of like feels like driving on a Maine country road or something like that. So I call the song Roots, kind of dedicated to my parents who still live up there, and but also thinking about Steve Swallow and something that he would solo over. And unfortunately, when we recorded this, the take it came out too long, and there were some mistakes in it, and so it exists in like a spliced up version that he has. But so it's called Roots, and inspired by Steve and my parents. That's all I got. Don't let me talk more. I'll never shut up. Right on it? Or do we do an intro?
We did the intro in our
Okay. Okay, well, that's why we rehearsed, so you could remind me of that. And it says intro, so I'm just, okay, cool. Okay, with the intro. Okay, boss. Yeah, it's a lazy intro. It's an intro, outro. Yeah.
Henry Lugo on the bass. Mike McGinnis on the woodwinds and the pen.